Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. For China, the war in the Middle East has had a range of impacts. Not only has it targeted Iran, a country with which Beijing has a comprehensive strategic partnership, but it has disrupted global trade, hitting China's exports and further rattling domestic consumer confidence. Yet the Chinese government's policy of stockpiling oil over recent years has helped to shield it from the worst of the disruption, and it has stepped in to protect consumers from the extremes of rising petrol prices. And many analysts say the apparent hope of some in the US administration that China would be undermined by the war has not materialised. In fact, Beijing may benefit from the damage to US global credibility. China has certainly sought to highlight its role as a responsible diplomatic player, proposing a joint peace plan with Pakistan, holding talks with various Gulf leaders, and, during a visit to Beijing by Iran's foreign minister in early May, backing what it called a new security framework for the region. There may also be fresh economic opportunities for China in terms of post-war rebuilding and development as Gulf countries seek to build new port and railway infrastructure to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. Yet while Beijing has called repeatedly for shipping to be restored, it did veto a Bahraini resolution opposed by Iran to guarantee safety of navigation in the strait at the UN Security Council in early April. And some analysts believe Beijing faces a precarious balancing act as it seeks to maintain both its close ties to Iran, 90% of whose oil goes to small, so-called teapot refineries on China's eastern coast, and its fast-growing economic ties to the Gulf states. So how will recent events affect China in the longer term? Well, we're joined today from the Gulf by Jonathan Fulton, Professor of International Relations at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, editor of the China Middle East and North Africa newsletter, and also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Well, Jonathan, thanks so much for talking to us. How do you think China's leaders perceive the current situation? And will Beijing ultimately be a winner or a loser from this war?
Okay, so I think really, and I understand this is a China podcast, so we have to focus on how China sees it, but really across the entire Indian Ocean region, you're seeing kind of similar dynamics, more or less affecting other countries, depending on how well they were prepared energy-wise. So on the economic front, yes, China was better positioned than most because it had several years of buying discounted Russian and Iranian crude oil, and their reserves were very well stocked. If this had happened, say, 15 or 20 years ago, China would have been in a very precarious situation. But they took the lesson, I think, from the Iraq invasion and that disaster and realized that they were vulnerable to oil shocks, and they had built up pretty substantial reserves and LNG reserves. And of course, they've got a tremendous deposit of coal. So in terms of domestic energy consumption, China's better positioned, I think, than a lot of other Asian economies. But then you just look at the second level effects of China is the world's biggest exporter. And who are you exporting to at a time of financial crisis? So you could see the economic reports in January and February that China was quite well off. The deeper we go into this, the less rosy they look. We know that property values have been decreasing.
You mean in China?
In China, yes. And most people's second largest purchase after a home is going to be a car, and car purchases have been decreasing pretty significantly. Retail, services, hospitality, plastics, manufacturing, all this stuff is decreasing as a result of this. So the idea that China's positioned itself well, I don't think really tells us the whole story. And then there's the broader question. I mean, what are they thinking? I think they're thinking what all of us are. We're in a situation where this is a crisis, a manufactured crisis imposed on the world basically by two people, Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. And I think that also is a pretty significant political vulnerability that all of us are facing. And I think for the Chinese leadership, they're looking at it and thinking, how can we limit our vulnerability to these types of decisions in the future?
There have been suggestions that for Chinese leaders, there's also a sense that this could damage the US in the longer term and that has some benefits for Beijing. We've seen senior Chinese academics saying things like, the conflict has loosened the US alliance system and shattered American hegemonic credibility. Do you think that the sort of economic concerns outweigh those kind of factors for China in the way it looks at the world?
Well, I think it's true. You can see a lot of US allies realize that those alliance partnerships aren't what they used to be, and countries are having to rethink their outlook. So the fracturing of that Western relationship maybe does have some spillover effects that are positive for China. But I would push back on the idea that this is a net good for China. Just because America looks increasingly bad doesn't mean China looks good. And you can see a lot of other countries that have had deep reservations about China's vision for world order. They don't find those any more appealing today just because America is so unpredictable. You could see the European Union was saying, they don't want to form any kind of denser economic ties or an economic deal with China because China's relationship with Russia undermines European security. I think what it means for China is economically, yes, it creates opportunities that are useful. I think most countries realize that from that period of 2017 until recently, where we were all talking about great power competition all the time, that created maybe a lower ceiling for what many Western countries in particular were willing to do with China. And those ceilings have been raised a bit because, you don't face the same kind of cajoling from Washington to say, don't buy a Chinese EV, for example, which was something that the Biden administration was very serious about. And countries are willing to say, well, if we're being tariffed by the US and we're losing easy access to that incredibly important market, where are we going, right? Of course, we're going to go to China. So that does create opportunities, but I think most countries are going into it with their eyes wide open.
In terms of China's own diplomacy, the Chinese leadership has attempted at least to be quite actively involved in attempts to find some form of peace for the region. We saw that China proposed, along with Pakistan, a peace plan. We've also seen Xi Jinping talking to the leaders of Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi and coming out with different proposals for peace and stability. And he called for the opening of the Strait of Hormuz when it was closed recently. Do you think that Beijing is playing a significant role, or are they doing this partly for their own audience to show that they are an important power from their own perspective?
So your latter point about domestic constituencies, I think, is important, and it's one that I think non-China watchers maybe have to keep in mind, is that a lot of the time when China is proposing these more activist positions in parts of the world where China is not typically a major actor, that's often to show people at home, look, we are a good faith actor. People want more China involvement. I think that's meant to reassure people at home. But in terms of what China's been doing in the Middle East, I mean, is it significant? I guess it's somewhat significant. I don't think it really moves the needle, so to speak, on any of these issues. You mentioned China's 5-point plan that they rolled out with Pakistan. And I have a newsletter, the China MENA newsletter that I publish on Substack. And when this 5-point plan was released, I wrote about it. And what I did is I kind of put it in the context of China's other 3, 4, 5-point plans for the Middle East. And what I found, I was a little surprised. There have been 7 of these things since 2013. 4-point proposals on Palestine, Israel, and 3-point plans on the two-state solution, and 5-point plans on, security and stability and solving the Syrian issue. In
Mhm.
looking at each of these, one of the big takeaways for me is that none of them have done anything. None of them have achieved any of the outcomes they were designed to achieve, or that they purported to be designed to achieve. And I don't think that was a bug. I think it was a feature. When China talks about these X-point plans for the Middle East, they're very normative. They're based on principles of how would China like to see things be resolved. We would like to see political solutions rather than the use of force. We want to emphasize non-interference. We want to focus on the UN's role in solving disputes. They're based more on preferred norms and principles than any kind of action plan, right? It's not like they're saying, these are the steps diplomatically we're going to take to solve this problem. these are the things we're going to do to solve the crisis in Lebanon. It says this is what we wish would be taken into account when these crises gets addressed by a larger group of actors at some point. So I'm always, when I hear about these blank point plans, I take them with a grain of salt because they're not really meant to solve the problem. They're meant to articulate how China thinks global governance should work. And I think most people in the Middle East kind of see it the same way because they've, like I said, they've seen seven of these things, seven or eight of them now over the years, and they realize that China doesn't come in like the Norwegians or the Americans or whoever that have, a very deep diplomatic background on these issues, where China is a relative newcomer and it doesn't really have the same kind of network of actors, of diplomats in the Chinese MOFA.
The
So
Ministry of Foreign Affairs, yeah.
the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, yes, that know all of the important players in each country. So it doesn't really, carry the same weight when China says we want to wade into this issue, because nobody really thinks China has the depth of experience or networks that's required to really be a major actor.
It did seem striking that China and Pakistan proposed this plan together just at the end of March, I believe it was. But then, when the peace talks were eventually held in Pakistan, it seemed to be purely a Pakistani initiative. So I don't know quite what happened to the Chinese role in all of this.
Yeah, so there were rumors that there were Chinese in Islamabad who were kind of behind the scenes, or that China was coordinating closely or liaising with the Pakistanis behind the scenes. But you're right, this was, Pakistan was playing the lead role in this particular drama.
There have also been suggestions that other countries, even in the region, such as Saudi Arabia, for example, have hoped that China's theoretically close relations with Iran, it's remained one of the main customers for Iranian oil through all these years, for example, would give it some leverage over Iran. I mean, do you think that any of the regional players have hoped that China could influence Iran? And what do you think of the way that China has dealt with Iran during this crisis?
So, if anybody in the region believes that China has influence in Iran, I think they've been disabused of that belief long ago. There are times when China can use its economic leverage with the Iranians to get some kind of outcome, but that's at a time when Iran is facing economic problems. And since October 7th, 2023, Iran hasn't been facing economic problems. It's been facing existential problems. And it's what they need isn't, infrastructure, free trade. Of course, the hard cash that they're getting from oil has been useful, but I think the idea that China has influence enough to get Iran to change its behavior when it's facing an existential crisis is quite naive. If China were willing to offer air support, if China were willing to send weapons, then it would have immediate influence in Iran. The problem is China's approach to the region has always tried to maintain some kind of a diplomatic balance, even while it's economically very imbalanced. China's trade and construction contracting relationship with the GCC countries is enormously greater than anything it does with Iran.
These are
So
the Gulf
the Gulf
Cooperation.
Cooperation Council
Yeah.
countries. It's a grouping that was formed in 1981 as a result of the Iran-Iraq War. These then smaller population countries of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Oman, Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait. And these countries have been tremendously lucrative for China throughout the Belt and Road era. They're all pursuing very aggressive development agendas that require infrastructure construction and creating new industries and renewable energy projects. And Chinese state-owned enterprises have been making, literal fortunes on the Arabian Peninsula. So, yes, China has a comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran, and that means that diplomatically they're quite close. They have the same type of agreement with the Saudis and the Emiratis. So, because of this kind of attempt at balance, China can't do those things that Iran needs. It can't send weapons because the Iranians would use them against the Saudis and the Emiratis. And of course, that would destroy China's relationship with those countries.
There have been suggestions from particularly people in the US that China is covertly involved in supporting Iranian defense. What's your view on that situation?
Yes, they do kind of small scale defense cooperation with a lot of countries that I'm sure the US and its allies and partners would rather they not. And they do it, with Russia, for example, with dual use components through robust trade relationships. And the same dynamics happen with the Iranians. When different organizations are able to poke around in these Iranian drones that get shot down, previously in Ukraine and now here on the Arabian Peninsula, you do find Chinese components in them. And the Chinese will have plausible deniability because they'll say, yeah, we sell electronics goods to lots of people. We can't control where all this stuff goes. Maybe less clandestinely, we saw different chemicals that are used as rocket fuel that have been shipped to Iran. There were two such shipments that were supposedly made last year, and one that was supposedly made right after the war started. So, yeah, China is supplying Iran with certain components or materials that can be used for defense purposes, but it's nothing like sending them scores of missiles or fighter jets or munitions. That would be a bridge too far because for local actors here in the Gulf, it would seem like China were tipping the scales. And that would affect their commercial relationship and it would affect the relationship with the US as well.
In terms of China's links with Iran, obviously there's been a lot of talk recently about the Chinese oil refineries, which buy a significant part, I believe it's up to 90% of Iran's oil. And these are mainly smaller refineries on the coast in Shandong province in eastern China, which are officially not part of the big state oil conglomerates, but in some cases may have dealings with them. The US Treasury has suggested that the sanctions could be taken out against companies that deal with these refineries. What do you think is going to happen to this trade? I mean, it seems like quite a curious trade, how it evolved, why these companies became the people who bought the Iranian oil in the first place.
So yeah, these teapot refineries, it is a very curious trade because they are meant for domestic consumption. They're refining oil for domestic use. And that means that theoretically you can't sanction them, right? They're not international companies. They're not attached to SWIFT in any way. And that's the primary means of sanctioning. The American International Payment System, SWIFT. So that's a major tool in America's economic statecraft. We can shut you down from SWIFT, and then you can't access international markets this way. And these refineries have been kind of siloed off from that. But this week, the US Treasury said we're going to go after the banks that do business with these refineries. And that's the workaround because those banks need US dollars and they need access to US markets as well. So I guess that's a way to use leverage over these refineries. But it's just in themselves, they're a very interesting situation. So just before Donald Trump took office last year, the Shandong Port Management announced internationally, we're not going to do business, we're not going to take offload cargo from any vessel that's under US sanctions. And that meant Venezuela, Russia, Iran. And the next day at the press briefing, somebody asked the Ministry of Foreign Affairs press spokesperson about this. And they made it very clear. They said China is resolutely against American sanctions as a means of statecraft. We oppose this, but we can't convince a private commercial actor like Shandong Port Management. We can't tell them what to do, right? They're a business. And if they don't want to get hit by US secondary sanctions, there's not much we can do about that. And another thing which I didn't realize until recently was that they have import quotas, and they had, like you said, they've been taking as much as 90% of Iran's oil. And that meant that they were hitting those quotas quite early in the calendar year. And before the war started, there was a report that they weren't able to process any more Iranian crude, that they had reached their limit for the quarter or whatever. And that meant there were tankers going up and down the coast trying to find a place to unload all this Iranian crude. And they couldn't find anybody because nobody else had that kind of shielding that the
Quota.
Chinese teapots.
So the quotas are imposed by the Chinese government.
Yes,
So they're allowed to import a certain amount each year.
right.
But at the same time, I mean, although you say the Shandong authorities said that they didn't want to get involved with sanctioned countries, it does appear that the
They
trade
did.
has carried on.
Well, I think what happened was, so like I said, this was when just before Trump took office. I think they were trying to curry favor with Washington to say, look, we are holier than the Pope. But after the failed Liberation Day tariff war with China, when China hit back with the rare earths, I'm sure a lot of commercial actors in China felt maybe they were bulletproof. They felt a little less sensitive to America's demands.
We have obviously read that China is now looking for other places to buy oil, and their purchases from Russia and Indonesia and places have increased in the past few months. There is the theory that this will encourage China's transition towards renewable energy. I don't know if that's something that you can see from your part of the world at all.
Absolutely. I mean, China typically gets 40 to between 40 and 50% of its crude from Gulf producers through the Strait of Hormuz, whether it was Iran, Iraq, or the GCC countries. But that's kind of a historical anomaly. That's not normal. It's just been the past, say, 2 decades. They've always imported a lot, but never at that scale. They like to spread the geopolitical risk around, and you'd see a lot of imports from Latin America and Asia and Africa. I think, ironically, it was this US security architecture in the Gulf that was reassuring. This idea that you could go into a very contentious region knowing that the US Navy and these US bases conferred a degree of stability. You know, we've all known that the straits could be closed because Iran's been saying this for 47 years. But what we didn't know was that an American president could be so reckless as to do something to result in Iran closing it. So there was this awareness, like there's a point at which we can't go any further because the cost would be, disastrous. So that was reassuring to China. We can continue to buy a lot of oil and gas. We can pursue contracts. Our citizens can live in that part of the world with a degree of safety. So now I imagine what Beijing is thinking is let's get back to diversification. And as you said, China's got an eye towards 2 years, 2030 and 2060. 2030 is meant to be, this important year in China's transition towards cleaner energy, that they want to import a lot less crude and use a lot less hydrocarbons in their energy basket, and they want to achieve net zero by 2060. And that actually has effects here. I mean, Gulf countries are also trying to navigate a post-hydrocarbon world. And Chinese companies have done a lot of business here, helping to build renewable energy infrastructure for these companies or countries. So, yeah, we absolutely see that here. It's a big part of China's trade relationship here is renewable energy.
We have also still seen China buying oil from other Gulf states to sort of compensate for some perhaps of what they've lost from Iran. And do you think that the decision by the United Arab Emirates to leave OPEC will lead to it selling more of its oil to China? I mean, it will give it more flexibility in theory in terms of what it does with its oil.
It absolutely will have no more production quotas, which I'm sure they'll be happy about. They'll be able to pump more stuff out of the ground and sell it. But also, I mean, the UAE's been pursuing a very independent foreign policy for a while, and they've been signing what they call CEPAs, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreements. They started doing this in 2022. They signed one with India, and a big part of it is, let's have more energy cooperation. So that doesn't necessarily mean that China's at the front of the line because, India's at the front of the line. India's a major partner for the UAE, and they have very dense energy relationship as well. So it could be that China might stand to benefit from this, but I think it's going to be competing in a pretty competitive marketplace with a lot of other countries with pretty significant needs.
You've touched on the scale of Chinese investment in the Gulf and in these GCC countries. And when we spoke to you last year on the podcast, you talked about the large number of Chinese people who had migrated to the region. And there was a recent Economist piece about how many sort of super rich Chinese people are now living in Dubai, where I believe there's also a Chinese government-run Chinese school. There are something like, is it 370,000 Chinese people officially in the UAE, thousands of Chinese companies, even, I believe, Chinese self-driving taxis on the streets. So, How has the war impacted them? Clearly, we've seen that many people have left the region since it began. How is it affecting Chinese communities, who maybe people would expect to be a bit more willing to take risks for sort of economic opportunities, but has it driven some people away as well?
So what you see, it's really interesting, and it also speaks to one of the things about the China-Iran relationship versus the China-GCC relationships that doesn't really get picked up on from those outside the region. During the 12-day war last June, June 25, China had to evacuate its nationals out of Iran, and they had to evacuate between 1 and 2,000 people. Iran is a country of 94 million, and there's about 2,000 Chinese nationals in the supposed important partner. And you're right, the report here, they say anywhere between 370,000 and 400,000 Chinese in the UAE, a country of 10 million. It's a major, major divergence. There's a lot of reasons for this. Obviously, living in Dubai is more fun than living in Iran. You don't want to live in a country that has a terrible economy with sanctions and security threats. And Dubai's got lots of great brunches and Chinese restaurants and great shopping, and it's a fun city. But the UAE is a very low barrier to entry if you want to come here and set up an international business. There's a lot of free zones with tremendous incentives to set up a business here. They'll give you subsidies and tax breaks and office space and easy access to visas for your staff. And you can make a lot of money relatively easily. Across the GCC countries, you'll find a lot of Chinese in Saudi and in Qatar and less in Bahrain and Oman and Kuwait, but a pretty substantial Chinese community in this part of the world. Now, that creates problems for China, obviously, when there's a war, because there's simply no way to evacuate that many people, right? It's a security nightmare.
How has that affected the Chinese community then? And are there many Chinese people who have sort of come with their families, the middle classes, or are they more either people who are laboring or people who are running businesses?
Like you said, Dubai has opened this Chinese international school. It's the only state curriculum international school in the world. And they did that because there's an enormous demand for it here in the Emirates. There's a huge middle class, a huge business community, a huge white collar community. All of these tech people, you mentioned the robo taxis, these AI companies, these digital commerce companies, these tech bros and the crypto guys, and people who run hotels or banks. There's supermarkets, there's, the whole gamut, right? So what that means
Hmm.
is you have a large community of people who have come here and set up a life. They've started businesses, their kids have enduring friendships. I've been here for 20 years. My kids were desperate when this started. They're like, oh, we don't want to leave. All of our friends are here. So it's the same
When the
dynamic
war
when the war
started.
started. Yeah. So, some people who don't have those deep roots did go home. A lot of them have since returned with, as the ceasefire looked durable. A lot of people were given a work from home order. So they would say, well, I can work from home in Shenzhen just as easily as I can from Dubai. So people would get out of the line of fire, so to speak.
So these were
Uh,
people working, say, for Chinese businesses in
sure.
administrative type jobs.
That it could be like UAE government positions or private companies or whatever. So, some people did go home during the worst of it and they've come back. Some people have kind of had their eyes opened and thought, wow, maybe it's not as stable as we thought, and they'd rather not be here. But mostly, again, you see people that have started a business, have settled roots, and they seem like they're in it for the long haul.
And there have been suggestions that there could be new opportunities for Chinese companies in sort of rebuilding in the region after the war. And as you mentioned earlier, that perhaps even more interest in Chinese green energy technology. So do you think that in the long run, this won't have a huge effect on the growth of Chinese investment and involvement in that region?
I think China's commercial involvement will continue. Absolutely. One thing that we've seen again is the vulnerability of having so much of your energy infrastructure bottled up in the Persian Gulf and having to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And countries like Saudi and Oman and the UAE that have coastline access to different points to the Arabian Sea or the Gulf of Oman have been in the process of developing the infrastructure to get more of their product out of the country through there. And that will create opportunities, I'm sure, for Chinese construction companies. One thing the UAE's been doing over the past decade is building this rail network that connects ports, and that also has access to the Arabian Sea. And Chinese companies got a lot of contracts in building that. So I imagine for construction, for infrastructure, for trade, for digital services, Chinese companies are going to continue to do quite well here. One thing I do wonder is you kind of see from a lot of countries on this side of the Gulf that had a sense that we've put a lot of effort into protecting your citizens during very trying times. You've always had great commercial relationships with us. We've created opportunities for you to come here and do business. In our moment of need, where are you? And where China's been is kind of mushy, right? China, again, with these 5 point plans that don't lead to anything, with support for Iran, with using its veto in the UNS, the United Nations Security Council, to block this Bahraini initiative to reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
But that was a bit earlier in the process, right?
Yeah. So in a lot of the areas where people on this side of the Gulf thought that their strong relations with China might have earned them a little more tangible support, look at it and think you haven't really stepped up when we need you. And meanwhile, although the US started this, they're looking at the Americans and thinking, well, whose Patriot missiles and whose THAAD systems have been shooting down these Iranian missiles and drones?
Defending the GCC countries from attack by Iran.
Exactly. So I think the perception for a lot of people in Europe and the UK and North America is that there'd be deep frustration with the Americans, that people here are deeply frustrated. But I think at the end of the day, a lot of the elites feel that they were right to double down on this American security relationship because it's what's protected them. And the view is the only country who can support us in a meaningful way has turned out to be the US. And China hasn't really done much, right? China has sent thoughts and prayers, but they haven't really sent anything meaningful. So I think in terms of the commercial relationship, it'll continue. But I think there's been since October 7th, 23, when the Hamas attack on Israel and the Red Sea shipping crisis and the 12-day war and this ongoing security nightmare in the Middle East, China's had a very modest footprint. They have sent special envoys, they've continued to do trade, but it's been proven time and again that there's a very low ceiling of what China can do to contribute to Middle Eastern security issues. And I don't mean that as a criticism, I just mean it as a fact. This isn't a priority region for China. East Asia, Southeast Asia, these are priority areas for China. It looks at this as a place to get energy and do business. And it's not willing or able to really play that kind of robust role. So I think countries here and leaders here probably look at it and think, okay, we've right-sized our expectations. We know what to expect. Sure, business will do business with you, but let's not talk about, joining the global security initiative as if it will mean something for us.
And to follow up on the idea of business being the primary concern, how does that affect China's relationship with Israel? Because clearly China has opposed this war, but has that changed its interest in doing business with Israel in any way?
So I've been tracking Chinese EV sales to the Middle East a lot lately. I co-authored a report for the European Council on Foreign Relations, not because I care about cars, but because I think it's interesting. It's weird. Biggest importer of Chinese EVs by scale is Israel. And that's continued since the Gaza war, where China diplomatically has hammered Israel time and again. It doesn't affect the commercial relationship. Israel and China continue to trade. I think China is Israel's biggest trading partner, maybe after the European Union. And on diplomatic issues, the Israelis are very frustrated with China. China's voting behavior in the United Nations frustrates Israel, but it doesn't hurt them from doing business. And that might be a model for us to think about with other Arab countries in this part of the world that have been, underwhelmed by China's support in this war, to say, okay, well, we can still trade. We're merchants at heart. A lot of these societies love to trade. China loves to trade. We can meet in the middle, but that doesn't mean we necessarily trust you with our security.
Sounds like a kind of Silk Road for the modern era.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Well, Jonathan Fulton, thank you so much for joining us on China in Context.
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun.
That's all we have time for on this episode. You can find out more about SOAS China Institute events and read our blog articles on our website soas.ac.uk. For now, thanks for listening and goodbye.